You will not believe what happened inside that courtroom, because the very moment the case was called and the young black lawyer walked forward in her neatly pressed navy blue suit, holding nothing more than a stack of files, and the confidence. In her eyes, the entire chamber seemed to pause, as though uncertain how to receive her presence. The jury members shuffled in their seats. The opposing counsel smirked with the type of arrogance that only comes when someone is already convinced of their own victory, and even the gallery whispered among themselves, wondering if she would stumble in her opening or falter under the weight of the expectations placed on her shoulders. The judge, a man who had spent decades behind the bench, leaned back in his chair with a skeptical smile, and for a split second, that smile transformed into something closer to a chuckle, as though the very idea of this young woman standing before him was a novelty, a passing amusement in an otherwise routine day of hearings. He didn't hide it either. The laughter was small, but it echoed just enough to reach the ears of everyone in the courtroom, and though subtle, it carried a sting, a message that this lawyer would not be taken seriously before she even spoke a single word. Yet she remained poised, adjusting her papers slowly, deliberately, almost as though she had anticipated this very moment and was prepared to let silence build until the room was forced to pay attention. Then, when she finally looked up, her gaze steady and unflinching, and opened her mouth to deliver her first sentence, something remarkable happened. Every whisper stopped, every smirk faded, and even the judge who had laughed found himself, leaning forward, compelled to listen in a way that betrayed how unprepared he had been for the force of her words. It was not just the eloquence of her speech, nor the undeniable logic woven into her phrasing, but the fire behind each syllable, a fire that came from years of struggle, resilience, and an unshakable determination to prove that brilliance has no color and justice has no bias. What followed was not merely the start of an argument, but the dismantling of an entire mindset, and with each carefully chosen phrase, she transformed the courtroom from a place of quiet doubt into an arena where respect was no longer requested but demanded, where her presence was not questioned but instead recognized as a force that could not be ignored. From that very first sentence, she silenced the laughter, commanded the room, and began a story that none of them would ever forget. The weight of her words carried through the air like a forceful wind, and it was not long before even those who had entered the courtroom with half-hearted attention found themselves leaning in, eager to catch every single phrase she released into that vast chamber. The silence was heavy, yet alive, vibrating with the sharp clarity of her reasoning, and what was most astonishing was not only the power of her language, but also the rhythm, the pacing, the way she paused at just the right moment to let her statements sink into the minds of the jurors. The opposing counsel, who at first had reclined comfortably in his chair, twirling a pen with the smugness of a man who had underestimated his competition, began to straighten, his lips tightening, into a line as the realization crept over him that he was not about to face an amateur, but rather a formidable opponent who had come fully prepared. The judge, who had moments ago allowed himself to chuckle, now leaned forward with his hands interlocked, listening intently, his earlier dismissal evaporating into a curiosity that bordered on respect. She painted pictures with her words, recounting details with precision, bringing to life the humanity of her client in such a way that the jurors no longer saw this as an abstract legal dispute, but as a matter of flesh, blood, and dignity. With every sentence, her voice seemed to grow stronger, not louder but firmer, and within that firmness was a kind of music, a cadence born from countless nights spent practicing, rewriting, and rehearsing her arguments until they no longer felt like memorized lines, but extensions of her very soul. And this was where the brilliance of her craft revealed itself. She wasn't simply reciting facts, she was weaving them into a narrative so compelling that those listening felt they were no longer spectators to a trial, but participants in a living story of justice being sought against the odds. The jurors' eyes reflected a change, one after another, turning from skepticism to focus, from uncertainty to empathy, and even the stenographer, whose job was merely to record, found herself momentarily caught in the tide of emotion that came, rolling off each word. The gallery had fallen so quiet that one could hear the faint scratching of the stenographer's keys, the shifting of papers, the occasional nervous cough, but otherwise nothing interrupted the spell she had cast. It was in this moment that the young lawyer's years of being doubted, overlooked, and underestimated crystallized into an undeniable truth. She belonged there, not as a token, not as an exception, but as a rightful voice of authority whose brilliance could not be ignored. And what made this even more powerful was how she carried herself, shoulders back, chin lifted, her eyes moving deliberately across each face in the jury box, making every juror feel as though her words were meant for them alone, as though the truth she spoke was theirs to uphold. What began as a courtroom filled with subtle mockery had now transformed into a sanctuary of listening, where the judge himself seemed silenced not by command, but by respect, where the opposing counsel began nervously scribbling notes in hopes of finding a crack in her arguments, and where the audience, though silent, sat on the edge of their seats as if witnessing not a legal battle, but a defining moment in history. And in truth, it was. For moments like these do not remain confined to the walls of a courtroom. They ripple outward, carried in the memory of all who were present, becoming part of a greater story about dignity, justice, and the undeniable strength that emerges when someone finally decides that their voice will no longer be silenced. As she moved deeper into her opening, the story she built began to take on the form of a living tapestry, each thread meticulously woven together with care and intentionality, and though her words remained steady, there was a quiet intensity behind them that no one in that room could deny. It wasn't simply that she was articulate. It was that her articulation came from lived experience, from countless years of being told she wasn't enough, of being dismissed in classrooms, underestimated in internships, overlooked in interviews, and doubted in professional circles where people who looked like her rarely occupied positions of power. All of that history, all of those buried frustrations, had been refined into something sharp and radiant, and it shone through her every phrase. The jurors may not have known her biography, but they could feel it. They could sense in her delivery that she was not simply arguing a case, but staking her very identity on the line. That was what made her words different. She spoke not only with logic, but with the authenticity of someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. The judge, who had once allowed himself the luxury of laughter at her presence, now seemed rooted to his chair, his pen idle against the pad before him, his eyes following her every movement with a mixture of fascination and something that almost resembled shame, as though he realized in real time the error of dismissing her before she even began. The opposing counsel shuffled uncomfortably, crossing and uncrossing his legs, his earlier smugness disintegrating as he scrambled to adapt, searching for flaws that simply weren't there. Meanwhile, her client sat at the table beside her, visibly moved by the transformation unfolding before his very eyes, his hands clasped together tightly, as if drawing strength from every sentence she released into the air. Each point she made was grounded in evidence, yet she delivered it with the grace of a storyteller, connecting the dots in such a way that the narrative became undeniable. She wove law and humanity together seamlessly, quoting statutes and precedents not as cold legal jargon, but as affirmations of her client's dignity and rights, breathing life into clauses and sections that might otherwise seem lifeless. The gallery, which had begun with murmurs and hushed laughter, now sat in an almost reverent quiet, eyes fixed on her, heads nodding unconsciously as though the entire courtroom had been collectively realigned to her rhythm. And within this transformation lay the undeniable truth. She had not just silenced the courtroom, she had elevated it. No longer was this merely about whether she could hold her own. It was about whether anyone else in that room could rise to meet her. She set a bar so high with her eloquence, her composure, her command of the facts, that the question shifted from her competency to theirs. Could the opposing counsel match her precision? Could the judge, despite his authority, maintain the dignity of his bench after beginning the trial with such casual dismissal? Could the jurors, faced with such clarity, ignore what she made impossible to ignore? The power had shifted, imperceptibly but irrevocably, and everyone in that room felt it. What struck them most was how she wielded her authority, not with arrogance or aggression, but with calm certainty, the kind of certainty that comes not from entitlement, but from relentless preparation and unshakable conviction. Every sentence was like a stone laid carefully into the foundation of her case, and the more she built, the more it became clear that this was not a fragile structure easily toppled, but a fortress of reasoning, integrity, and truth. And as she continued, her words stretched beyond the courtroom walls, becoming a statement about the world itself, about the countless others who had been laughed at, dismissed, underestimated, and yet carried within them the brilliance to change the outcome, the moment they were given the chance to speak. The brilliance of her argument did not fade as the minutes stretched into hours. Rather, it seemed to grow, unfolding layer by layer like a symphony carefully composed, each movement building upon the last until the weight of her case became something no one in that courtroom could shake off. What had begun with a simple introduction evolved into a meticulously detailed journey through every aspect of the evidence, and with each new point she introduced, she reinforced not just the strength of her client's position, but the strength of her own mastery over the craft of law. The jurors, once neutral observers, now seemed invested, their faces reflecting the subtle but unmistakable signs of persuasion, the slight narrowing of eyes in focus, the unconscious nodding as her logic settled into their thoughts, the occasional glance exchanged between them that said without words, "She is right." The opposing counsel scribbled furiously on his yellow legal pad, as though somehow by sheer force of note-taking he could dismantle the impenetrable wall she was building around her argument, yet even he knew deep down that the structure rising in front of him was too well fortified, too carefully crafted to collapse under the weight of his counterpoints. The judge, for his part, remained still, his earlier arrogance gone, his face transformed into one of sober attention, and though no one could read his thoughts with certainty, it was clear that he was no longer listening out of duty, but out of a kind of humbled respect. For the young lawyer, this was not just a performance, it was vindication. Each page of notes she turned over carried not only legal precedents and citations, but also the echoes of all those who had told her she did not belong, the professors who doubted her, the colleagues who spoke over her in meetings, the strangers who looked surprised when she introduced herself as an attorney. And in that moment she carried them all with her, but not as burdens. She carried them as fuel, transforming every dismissal she had endured into the fire that propelled her voice. Her client sat silently beside her, his eyes moist with a gratitude that words could never capture, because he understood more than anyone that she was not simply defending him, she was redefining the very terms of the battle. Each time she looked up from her papers and met the eyes of a juror, she was not just presenting evidence, she was asking for something deeper: recognition, acknowledgement, justice, not only for her client, but for every individual who had been overlooked or silenced. The gallery was transfixed. Even those who had entered the room out of idle curiosity now sat forward, as if they were watching a play more gripping than any they had ever seen, except this was not fiction, this was not entertainment. This was reality unfolding in real time, and its consequences would ripple far beyond those four walls. The rhythm of her voice carried like a steady drumbeat, sometimes rising with passion, sometimes dropping into deliberate quiet, forcing everyone to lean in closer and always holding the audience within her grasp. She quoted prior rulings with precision, dissected the opposing counsel's earlier filings with surgical clarity, and pointed out contradictions so deftly that one could almost hear the collective intake of breath from those who realized just how thoroughly she was dismantling the foundation of the other side's case. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys, struggling to keep up, and more than once the stenographer glanced up with wide eyes, as if even she could not help but be pulled into the current of this young woman's momentum. And yet, perhaps the most powerful part of her presence was not what she said, but how she carried herself in the moments between words, the steady breath, the unwavering eye contact, the slight lift of her chin that communicated both humility and strength, the quiet confidence that told everyone in that room, "I belong here." It was in these silences, in those small pauses, that the true weight of her authority revealed itself, because silence in a courtroom is not emptiness, it is dominance, and she wielded it with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to weigh. Let the tension build until the silence itself became part of her argument. By the time she closed her binder and rested her hands gently on the table, there was no laughter left, no smirks, no whispers. There was only silence, silence not born of disinterest, but of awe. What happened next only deepened the transformation of that courtroom, because once her opening statement concluded and the weight of her words still lingered in the silence, the judge cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and in that tiny hesitation before addressing the court, everyone present understood that the balance of power had shifted. It was no longer the judge who controlled the tempo of the room, nor the opposing counsel who had expected to dictate the narrative. It was her, the young black lawyer who had been laughed at before she even began. And though the official proceedings pressed forward with witnesses being called and evidence being introduced, every moment of testimony seemed to orbit around the gravity she had already established. When the first witness for the opposing side took the stand, the seasoned lawyer across from her tried to regain control, walking through rehearsed questions, attempting to lead the jury back toward his framing of the case. But it was clear that the momentum was gone. The jury listened politely, yet their eyes wandered. Some glanced back toward her, waiting for her cross-examination, almost as if they knew the real trial would not begin until she spoke again. And when she did rise, smooth and deliberate, to approach the witness stand, there was a ripple of anticipation through the room, a subtle shift of bodies in chairs, the kind of quiet movement that betrays heightened attention. She did not rush. She did not intimidate. She simply asked questions so precise, so calm, that the witness's confidence began to unravel with startling speed. Each answer she drew out chipped away at the opposing counsel's earlier narrative, not with aggression, but with the effortless inevitability of truth catching up to falsehood. Even the judge raised his brows at moments, surprised at how quickly she exposed contradictions, and the opposing counsel could only object half-heartedly, his voice tinged with frustration because he knew that no matter how many times he interrupted, her control over the witness was absolute. It wasn't just that she was dismantling testimony. It was that she was doing it with grace, never raising her voice, never losing composure, showing mastery in the very qualities people once doubted she could possess. By the time she returned to her seat, her client looked at her not simply as an attorney, but as a lifeline, someone who had restored dignity where it had been threatened. The gallery, which had sat restless during the opposing counsel's questioning, now sat riveted, whispering to one another in hushed tones, their admiration growing with every demonstration of her brilliance. But the most telling change was in the judge himself. His posture had straightened, his pen once again pressed to paper, not to dismissively doodle, but to record, to note, to pay attention. He was no longer the man who had laughed at her presence. He was the man who now recognized her command of the law, perhaps begrudgingly, but undeniably. And all throughout, she never faltered, never let the weight of the room press her down. Instead, she seemed to draw strength from it, as though the very doubt cast upon her became fuel to make her voice steadier, her reasoning sharper, her presence impossible to ignore. By the end of that day's proceedings, when the court adjourned, no one left the room with the same perception they had entered with. Those who had doubted her now carried the image of her standing unshaken before a witness, guiding truth out of hesitation and turning skepticism into belief. And as the judge rose to leave, he glanced at her, not with amusement, but with something much closer to respect, a subtle acknowledgement that he, too, had been silenced, not by force, not by demand, but by undeniable brilliance. The following. Days of the trial only magnified what had already been set in motion, because each time she rose to speak, whether to question a witness, object to a misleading claim, or clarify a point of law, the courtroom seemed to pivot around her as though she had become its very axis. The jurors began anticipating her words more than anyone else's. The gallery, once filled with idle observers, leaned forward with the same eagerness as if they were watching history unfold. And even the court clerks, who had witnessed hundreds of cases, whispered among themselves that there was something extraordinary happening before their eyes. The opposing counsel grew visibly weary, his polished demeanor cracking as he struggled to regain footing, his argument sounding increasingly defensive in contrast to her calm, clear assertions. Every time he attempted to trip her with legal technicalities, she dismantled his points with precision, often citing precedent cases, with such fluency that he had no room to respond. The judge, once an emblem of casual dismissal, had shifted so entirely that his body language betrayed admiration he did not voice aloud. Where once he leaned back with skepticism, he now leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, chin propped. On one hand, eyes focused intently on her, as though he were a student learning from a master. But the true heart of her strength came not just from her technical skill, it came from the way she never let the humanity of her client be lost amid the legal complexities. Time and again, she reminded the jury that this was not simply a matter of cold statutes or rigid rules, but about a person whose life, dignity, and future were at stake. She spoke of the small details, the hardships endured, the injustice faced, the consequences that would ripple into the future if justice was denied, and she did so without melodrama, letting the sincerity of her words and the authenticity of her tone carry the weight. By doing so, she anchored the case in something far more powerful than technicalities. She anchored it in truth. And what stunned everyone, especially the judge, was that her first sentence had not been a fluke. Not a moment of fleeting brilliance, but the consistent thread running through every single day of the trial. She had sustained that same composure, that same force, that same clarity from start to finish, and it became impossible to deny that her command of the courtroom was not circumstantial, but intrinsic. Each passing day eroded the last remnants of doubt anyone might have held. The gallery stopped whispering. They now sat in reverent silence. The jurors ceased their subtle signs of fatigue. They now looked sharper, as though her presence had energized them. And the opposing counsel, once so smug, now carried himself like a man battling uphill in a storm, his once practiced confidence dissolved into visible unease. Even the judge, though bound to neutrality, allowed small hints of change to escape, a wide softening in his eyes, a rare nod of acknowledgement when she struck a particularly profound point, and the absence of any dismissive smile. She had silenced the laughter not only in the literal sense, but in the deeper, more profound sense. She had silenced the very impulse to underestimate her. By the time she delivered her final cross-examination, a sweeping, meticulous unraveling of the opposition's key witness, the trial no longer felt like a question of if she would prevail, but merely of when. The final day of the trial arrived with an air of expectancy so thick that even the marble pillars of the courthouse seemed to echo with it, and as the young black lawyer prepared to deliver her closing argument, the entire room carried the hush of anticipation. Like the pause before a symphony's final crescendo, she rose slowly, not with the hurried energy of someone rushing to finish, but with the deliberate grace of a woman who understood that every eye was fixed upon her, every ear tuned to catch the last syllables she would offer in her defense of her client. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, as though pulled closer by an invisible thread. The gallery shifted in their seats, aware that they were about to witness the culmination of something far greater than a single trial. Even the judge, who had begun this case with a laugh, now straightened his robe and folded his hands with the solemnity reserved for moments of history. And when she began to speak, her voice did not thunder nor strain. It flowed, steady and powerful, carrying the weight of days of testimony, weeks of preparation, and years of resilience compressed into every carefully chosen phrase. She reminded the jury of the facts, weaving them into a seamless narrative where every inconsistency in the opposition's case was laid bare. But she also did something more. She humanized those facts, anchoring them in the lived experience of her client, making the law itself breathe with empathy and moral clarity. Her closing was not a demand, but an invitation to the jury to see justice not as an abstract concept, but as something tangible, something owed to a man who had walked into that courtroom vulnerable and nearly voiceless, yet now stood represented by a voice so undeniable it could never again be dismissed. As she spoke, there was no smirk left on the face of the opposing counsel. Instead, his gaze rested downward, his pen idle, as though he understood fully that he had been outmatched not only in skill but in conviction. The judge, for the first time, allowed a flicker of emotion to pass across his face. Not pity, not amusement, but respect. Raw and unmistakable respect for the young lawyer he had once considered a novelty. When she reached her final words, her voice softened, not in weakness but in strength, carrying a quiet certainty that reverberated through every corner of the room. Justice is not a gift to be granted. It is a right to be honored. And with that, she returned to her seat, her head held high, her client's hand trembling as it reached for hers in gratitude. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the realization that something extraordinary had just taken place, something that would be spoken of long after the verdict was delivered. For in that moment, she had not only silenced a courtroom, she had rewritten its memory. Where once there had been laughter, now there would only be reverence. Where once there had been doubt, now there was undeniable belief. And though the trial would conclude, though the jurors would deliberate and the verdict would be read, the legacy of her presence, her brilliance, and her first sentence that silenced them all would endure, etched into the minds of every soul who bore witness. She had entered that courtroom underestimated, even mocked, but she left it having transformed the very space around her, proving that no laugh, no prejudice, no dismissive glance could ever drown out the voice of truth once it finally spoke.